This week on Just Solutions, Congress has failed to pass federal voting rights legislation which would have strengthened access to the ballot for all Americans. Meanwhile, Donald Trump continues to push the big lie of a stolen election, and numerous state legislatures are passing laws that undermine the right to vote. So what can be done, particularly with the midterm elections looming later this year? The Brennan Center for Justice is one of the national organisations working hard to defend voting rights. Sean Morales-Doyle is the centre's acting director of voting rights and elections. He joins us today to discuss what's next. From Free Speech TV, Just Solutions. Sean, it's great to have you with us. Thank you so much for being here. We'll talk about the latest developments regarding the Electoral Count Act in just a moment. But regarding those two key pieces of federal legislation, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and the other piece as well, that was defeated in the Senate because of the filibuster. Is there a path forward for that right now?
Unfortunately, right now, what we saw a couple of weeks ago demonstrates that there aren't the votes necessary to change the rules in order to get those bills passed. And unfortunately, that's what's required, because the Senate rules don't allow the Senate to vote on even this most incredibly important legislation on a simple majority vote. So in the immediate future, it doesn't look like these bills are moving, but I don't think that takes away from how important it is that Congress does act on these issues. And so we will continue to be pressing for them. We'll continue to be pointing out just how urgent action is. But the fight in the immediate future may shift away from DC just a bit, as we have to continue fighting against restrictive voting laws in the states.
Well, I definitely want to talk about what's happening at a state level and even at a precinct level in just a moment. But this week, there was the announcement of efforts to shore up the Electoral Count Act, which would go some way to regulate or tighten up regulations on how elections essentially are administered and votes are regulated. So take us through exactly the significance of that and what it is.
Well, so the Electoral Count Act governs how the votes of the Electoral College are counted in Congress at the conclusion of a presidential election. And it's a very old and antiquated law, and frankly is written in a way that is not terribly clear. And we saw in 2021, really in January of 2021, and at the end of 2020, some attempts to sort of use the fact that is a vague law to claim that there was some route for overturning the results of the democratic election, which of course is not true. Those efforts were stopped in Congress despite a violent attempt at an insurrection happening outside. But it did sort of bring to the forefront of the political conversation the importance of clarifying that law. I think it's an important thing. It's important that the Electoral Count Act be clear. It's important that we shore up our democracy against the kinds of attacks that we saw in 2020 and 2021. But it just focuses on a very narrow piece of the way our democracy works, and really not the piece where we are seeing all of the attacks on voting rights right now. And so, fixing the Electoral Count Act may be important, but it is absolutely not a substitute for the kind of reforms that unfortunately failed to get through the Senate a couple weeks ago.
Well, let's take a look at what's happening state by state, because, of course, there's so much attention at the federal level around elections, but really all elections are certified and administered at a very local level. And there are a lot of laws being passed and efforts being made to activate very far right activists to move in. Steve Bannon has a podcast and a whole strategy around precincts and encouraging people to go in and become these precinct workers, committee members, all of this type of thing. And this is very concerning because of how our elections are governed and what happens at that very local level. So let's first of all take a look at some of these laws that have been passed and that are continuing to be introduced around states, around the country in different state legislatures. Take us through some of the more egregious ones that you're most concerned about.
Sure. So one example is Texas Senate Bill 1, which passed in the fall in Texas. And that's a law that actually we at the Brennan Center are suing to challenge in court on behalf of a number of clients, and actually in 2 separate lawsuits. That is one of a handful of laws that passed last year that we talk about as an omnibus voter suppression law, or sort of one of these monster bills, because it contains so many different restrictions on access to voting. And it really goes after voters in a number of ways, but also after the people who run our elections, who help voters. So it makes it much harder for people to provide assistance to voters who say have limited English proficiency or have a disability. It makes it much harder for voters. It makes it much harder for election workers to do what they need to stop this sort of partisan poll watching from getting out of hand at a polling place. It also criminalizes legitimate behavior by election officials, really laudable behavior by election officials. It makes it a criminal offense for local election officials to solicit mail ballot applications. So our client in one of those lawsuits, the Harris County Elections Administrator, Isabel Longoria, faces a minimum of 6 months in prison for taking action to encourage voters to apply to vote by mail. And it's a bill that just contains restriction on top of restriction. And when each one of them may sound to some as a minor imposition, but it's really when you add up all of these restrictions together and layer them on top of what was already one of the most restrictive systems in the country in Texas, that you really get to see the real life impact of how much harder it's going to make for people to vote. And we're hearing stories just in the last couple of weeks from counties in Texas about really high percentages, 1 out of every 4 mail ballot applications being rejected as a result of the new rules in this bill. And when you combine the fact that a ballot application is getting rejected at a rate like that, and that election officials can't do what they need to do the voter outreach to help people get past the kinds of hurdles that are placed in front of them, because it would be a crime for them to do so, you can see what kind of impact a law like that can have.
You mentioned there that was happening in Texas, that large omnibus bill that attacks so many aspects of voting. But election workers are being targeted in other states like Arkansas and Georgia. In fact, the state would have the power to remove elected officials, election officials who themselves are elected, if there's any sort of disagreement. That's incredibly concerning when we have seen, certainly in the last election, Donald Trump and the Republican Party placing incredible pressure on some of these local elected officials. Take us through that, how not just the criminalization of some of these election workers, but also the threat to fully remove them from their position.
Yeah, so the Georgia bill is one example of this new trend. Unfortunately, it is a trend that extends beyond Georgia. The Georgia bill does allow the state board of elections to remove local election officials in certain circumstances, and it also changes the way the state board of elections works in a way that makes us concerned about the possibility for partisan actors to have more of a role in say, removing a local election official. And that kind of partisan manipulation is really concerning after what we heard about in 2020, as you say. That was a state where the president was literally calling up the chief election official in the state and putting pressure on him to find some votes, in the president's own words. Unfortunately, the Georgia bill is only one example. Fortunately, it's one of the few that passed in 2021 of this kind, and most of the worst of them didn't pass. But to give an example of some of the other things that states are considering, the Texas bill that I just discussed was bad. It contained all kinds of bad provisions. But an earlier version of the bill that came really within hours of passage contained a provision that was literally called overturning election. That's what it was titled, and it would have given judges the ability to overturn, partisan judges the ability to overturn elections without proof that there was a basis for overturning the election. And we're seeing bills introduced now again in 2022 in legislative sessions that allow even citizens to challenge election officials and to try to bring suits to remove election officials from power. In addition to new bills that would give partisan lawmakers the ability to reject election results. There's a bill in Arizona that would allow the legislature essentially to reject the outcome of the election. So it's a new and extremely concerning trend. Fortunately, most of those bills haven't passed yet, although Georgia is an example of one that has. But the fact that they're even being considered and that new ones are being introduced in 2022 sort of as a new level of threat on top of the typical voter suppression laws that we've seen in the past.
This must have a very chilling impact on communities that where elected officials or election officials are already struggling with the big lie. We talked about that in the introduction. Donald Trump continues to push that and is rallying around the country, and in communities where there is support for that lie of election fraud in 2020, that must place incredible pressure on those election officials who are seeing this wave of support for these lies that are being put out there, and also this wave of legislation that's essentially undermining their role and responsibility.
Yes, absolutely. Election officials have come under attack since the 2020 election in unprecedented ways. As you mentioned, there's the legislation going after them, new criminal penalties being threatened. There is the big lie that somehow they were responsible for rigging the election in 2020, when actually election officials were in many ways the heroes of 2020. They're the reason why our democracy proved to be resilient and strong, that we had, in the opinion of the Department of Homeland Security, the most secure election in our nation's history, with record turnout, more than we've seen in 100 years for a presidential election. They made that happen in the midst of a pandemic, and in the midst of these sorts of attacks on our democracy, and they should be celebrated. Instead, they've come under attack, not only in the sort of legal ways we talked about, with laws being passed to come after them, but threats of physical violence. Election officials are facing, because of this lie that has perpetrated so many communities in the country, and that people seem to believe at disturbingly high rates, election officials are being threatened with violence. And so we're also seeing election officials leave their jobs en masse. Resignations like we've not seen before, retirements like we've not seen before. This is not often a highly paid job, and it isn't usually a job that's celebrated. It kind of happens in the background. And now people who are in these positions are being threatened with physical violence and attacked by lawmakers by legal means. And so a lot of them are just leaving the profession. At the same time as we're seeing people who buy into the big lie and who say they wouldn't have certified the election results in 2020 running for the office of election official in a lot of places in the country. And so it's really frightening to think what it would mean if, rather than having our elections run by people who support the legitimacy of our democratic system, we have our elections run by people who engage in election denialism, frankly.
And I mentioned earlier, there is a very concrete strategy in the part of very far right fringe white supremacist groups to actually infiltrate at a very local level our elections. The Proud Boys have this as a strategy. There are QAnon groups that have this. And I mentioned earlier, Steve Bannon, he actually supports people and has podcasts and all kinds of training, essentially telling people you need to go and run and get into these positions at a precinct level. He's calling it the Precinct Strategy. So when we talk about what election officials actually do, we often just use that catch-all phrase, election officials, but it plays out very differently depending on where you are. In one way, that gives strength, I suppose, because there are so many different roles involved. But in another way, it also makes it vulnerable because you can have lots of different people who don't necessarily have our democracy as their main interest infiltrated too. So what are election officials? What are some of the different roles that we're seeing some of these dynamics play out in?
Yeah, so there is a big range in our country. It is the case that elections are essentially run on a local level, but every state has a chief election official or a board that presides over elections for the entire state. But even at the state level, it varies. So as I said, in some states it's the Secretary of State, in some states it's a board of elections. In some states, the role of election officials split between a number of different officials, all the way down to the local level. And so it is also true that, in the state of Texas, the tax assessor plays a role in voter registration. In some states, you have a local board of elections in every county. In other states, you have an elections administrator or a county clerk. And so it really varies state to state. And I think that can be confusing for average citizens sometimes because they're not familiar with the details of how this plays out. But I'll also say the particularities of the way that these systems are set up, whether it's a board or whether it's an individual official or some combination of the two, there's not sort of one model that's much better than the other, or that there isn't necessarily a problem with having variation between the way that different states do this. So long as we have consistency in the way that elections operate. And that really is what is so important about one of the two pieces of federal legislation that we were talking about, the Freedom to Vote Act. What that bill would have done and would do is it would sort of set a national standard for what elections look like, for the kinds of access that voters need to be given, how many days of early voting there need to be, what sort of access is given to voting by mail. It is a feature of our American democracy that we have variation from state to state, and that can be a good thing, and it can provide for sort of different states to experiment with doing things different ways. But there is also value in consistency and in reducing confusion and in uniformity sometimes. And Congress was given the power in the Constitution to provide that for federal elections, to regulate federal elections in that way. And that really is why we've pushed so hard for the Freedom to Vote Act, to make sure that while we may have variation in the method for running elections, we don't have such wide variation in the access that voters have to elections.
Well, we'd love to hear from our viewers. Let us know where you're watching and your thoughts on this. Maybe you're in one of these states that we've mentioned where some of these voter restrictions are playing out. Paul, who's watching on YouTube, says everyone, if you're a citizen, should be able to vote for who they want to get into office. That seems to be the very basis of elections. And yet, as we're hearing, Sean, it's not always that simple. Two comments coming in on Facebook. Lynn and Jamie both say that we need voter and citizen ID. And this idea that Lynn says, how does having to show identification actually undermine our voting laws? Many of these laws that are being passed at a state level are around requiring identification, and many groups, voter rights advocacy groups, say that actually is not beneficial, that actually can undermine people's access to the ballot. So when people say, what's the harm in showing an identification? Surely that's all about election integrity. What are some of the concerns around that?
Sure. So the first thing I'll say is, I think oftentimes the debate over voter ID gets oversimplified to either you're pro-ID or you're anti-ID. And so people have this idea that voting rights advocates who oppose certain restrictive voting laws are saying showing ID is never appropriate in any circumstances. That's just not the case. The problem with voter ID laws is not that every voter ID law should be, tossed aside. In fact, there's federal law that requires ID in certain circumstances. The problem are very restrictive voter ID laws that require you to show a very small set of IDs that not everybody has, and don't provide any alternatives in case you are lacking that particular form of ID. But a second thing, and so the sort of biggest example of that was when Texas introduced a voter ID law back in 2011 that would have allowed you, say, to use a firearm license to vote, but not a state university ID to vote. And so it's the forms of ID and how restrictive they are that are the issue. It's also important to note that voter ID, though it may sound sensible to folks, is when we think about these really restrictive forms of voter ID laws, they're fixing a problem that doesn't really exist. In-person voter impersonation, showing up and pretending to vote as if you're somebody else, is vanishingly rare. It's more likely that a voter is struck by lightning than that they attempt to engage in that kind of impersonation. But I'd also just add on to that these sort of voter ID laws aren't actually the biggest trend that we're seeing right now. A lot of what we saw in 2021 were laws being passed to make it harder to vote by mail. And it's important to keep in mind that happened right after we saw this massive shift in who was voting by mail in 2020. So in Georgia and Florida and other places, we saw that Black voters were using vote by mail far more than they had in the past. And all of a sudden, states that had pretty expansive vote by mail systems in place for decades really started trying to restrict access to voting by mail. So voter ID really isn't sort of the central debate in this conversation in a lot of ways. And I think it can kind of be a distraction sometimes when we're talking about the new restrictive laws that states are enacting.
Well, I definitely want to talk about what can be done and certainly what the Brennan Center and other groups are doing. But just to put all of this into context and what might play out in the midterm elections and indeed in the 2024 elections, a lot of people think, well, January 6th, that's a very visual representation of an attack on our democracy. Other people are saying what we're more likely to see is just pure chaos, where you have all of these different communities, precincts, even county level officials failing to certify an election or being replaced because of some of these laws that we've mentioned. Is that the concern, that we'll just have chaotic elections that will lead ultimately to our demise in democracy, as opposed to another, say, coup attempt?
I mean, obviously, I don't want to downplay the terribly frightening scenes that we all witnessed last January 6th there. That is an incredibly concerning thing that we all saw happen, and we should all be very worried that that kind of thing could happen in the United States. But yes, I think after that attack on January 6th, what we saw for the next year, really, and we're continuing to see now, are states passing all of these laws to try to restrict access to voting, states attempting to pass laws to sabotage elections and allow partisan actors to manipulate the outcome. And as you've mentioned, people trying to run for the office of election official on the basis of the big lie, and that they wouldn't have certified the legitimate election results in 2020. So we face a lot of threats beyond the sort of physical attack on our Capitol that we saw in January 6th. And I do think, for generations, our democracy has proven resilient, and 2020 was actually a great example of that. And that we have always been able to get through the tough times and have a democracy that doesn't, devolve into chaos. But we are facing a sort of new and unprecedented time right now, where so many of voices in the public discourse are undermining faith in our democracy, are suggesting that there was an attempt, that the 2020 election was rigged, that the results weren't legitimate. And when you combine that sort of rhetoric with the kind of chaos that people are trying to create, it does present real concerns, because a democracy doesn't function if people don't believe in it, if there isn't public faith in it. And so some of what's so disturbing about what we're witnessing right now, whether it be the January 6th attacks, bills to try to undermine the integrity of the electoral process by giving power to partisan actors, or so many of these other trends we've talked about, what's really concerning is that they undermine the public's faith in elections. They make people think that our democracy doesn't function, that it isn't actually democratic, and that is really worrying.
So what is to be done? What can be done, Sean? I know you mentioned that the Brennan Center is leading legal action against that omnibus voter suppression bill in Texas. But as we've heard, it's playing out in many, many other states. So what can be done?
Unfortunately, without the tools that we were pushing for in Congress, we don't have as many tools to fight back against this wave of voter suppression and these attacks on our democracy as we'd like to, and as we should. And we don't even have the full protections of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 anymore because of multiple Supreme Court decisions doing damage to that law. But we do still have tools at our disposal, and we are going to continue in these fights. So we are going to sue to challenge laws like Senate Bill 1 in Texas. And we're not the only ones doing that. There have been lawsuits filed in many of the states that pass these restrictive voting laws, in Florida and in Georgia and in Montana and in many other places in the country. As I said, the federal courts as an option have been limited somewhat by a couple Supreme Court decisions. So that can't be the only place where we continue this fight. We're going to also continue this fight in state legislatures. And sometimes the outcome of those fights can feel sort of predetermined to people. It can feel like the Texas state legislature is inevitably going to pass a restrictive law no matter what we do. But I think it's important to look back at 2021 and see that Texas was considering passing a law that was called overturning elections. Georgia was considering passing a law that would have gotten rid of Sunday early voting, which was pretty transparently targeted at Black voters who engaged in Souls to the Polls initiatives. And both of those efforts were stopped as a result of shining a light on those efforts and public advocacy fighting back at those efforts, real outrage about those efforts. And so there's also a fight beyond the walls of the state capitol that we're engaging in at the Brennan Center that others need to, and sort of just, sounding the alarm and really engaging in public advocacy, winning this fight in the battle of public opinion. Our country will eventually overcome these obstacles if we can come together as a country in defense of our democracy. There's a reason why Congress was considering the John R. Lewis and Freedom to Vote Acts a couple of weeks ago, why they almost changed the Senate rules, why that became the center of the political conversation in our nation's capital. And that is because so many voices of constituents were being heard, because so many people were calling their senators, because so many people are making this a top issue on their list of priorities as voters, that voting rights is now moving to the center of the political conversation. That matters. So I would just say that, beyond the work of organizations like the Brennan Center to fight these battles in the courts and to fight these battles in state legislatures, to fight these battles on Capitol Hill, it's also important for everyday citizens to make this a priority and to make sure that their voices are being heard by their elected officials, so that this will remain at the center of the political conversation, and hopefully we can clear the hurdles that we have before us in the United States Senate.
I know there are a lot of resources on the website for the Brennan Center, and some of that includes getting people involved at this very local level. We talked about the far right strategy on that, but I know other people can absolutely go in and get involved at a very local level as poll watchers, observers, and even run for some of these offices. And I know as well the Brennan Center is also calling for support of those election officials who are under siege in many communities. So I would definitely direct people to the website. But in the meantime, Sean, what is the one thing that you think people should go out and do today if they are concerned about this?
I guess the first thing on my list is always to tell people to go vote. That's really important. The second thing on my list would be, and so I know you told me one thing. The second thing is talk to your elected officials. Tell them that you care about this issue. Emphasize to them how important it is they act on this issue. And if you can sign up to be a poll worker and help your local election official, then you should do that too.
I so appreciate you being with us today. Thank you so much, Sean.
Thank you for having me.
And don't forget that Just Solutions is also available as a podcast. You can subscribe to it so you never miss an episode, and listen to past shows as well. And don't forget to tune in and join us same time, same place next week for Free Speech TV, Just Solutions.